Central America is a region formed by 6 Latin American countries and 1 Anglo American nation. As an isthmus, it connects North America with South America, comprising the following countries: Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica and Panama. The inhabitants of Central America represent a variety of ancestries, ethnic groups, and races, making the region one of the most diverse in the world. Some countries have a predominance of European Amerindian or Mestizo population, some are dominated by inhabitants of European ancestry, and some countries' populations are primarily mixed. Black, Asian, and Afro-Amerindian minorities are also identified regularly. People with Mestizo ancestry are the largest single group, and along with people of European or part-European ancestry, they combine to make up approximately 80% of the population, or even more. Central America has a population of approximately 40 million in 2007 in an area of 523,780 square kilometers, with a 77.3 density of hab per square kilometer, although its population is not distributed equally. For example, Belize is larger than El Salvador in area by 1,924 square kilometers, but El Salvador has 30 times the population of Belize. Similarly, the population of Costa Rica is greater than that of Panama, though Panama is larger. Guatemala has the largest population with 13,276,517, followed by Honduras at 7,792,854. The following table shows the population and surface of each country with its respective density, population and density. Mestizos. Central American admixture began with the arrival of the Spaniards to Central America, whose consequences could still be perceived in the present-day Central American society. Mestizos are the result of the admixture between Spaniards and 2 different ethnic groups, Native Americans and Africans. Mestizos are majority in El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua and Panama, formed by 22,425,257 inhabitants, occupying the majority of the Central American population. All the 7 countries have significant Mestizo populations. Caucasians, the white ethnic group or white Latin Americans, have an estimated population of 7,494,000 inhabitants. Costa Rica. As of 2012, most Costa Ricans are of primarily Spanish ancestry, with minorities of German, Italian, French, Dutch, British, Swedish and Greek ancestry. Whites, Castizos and Mestizos together comprise 83% of the population. Whites and Castizos represent 65.8% of the total population. European migrants used Costa Rica to get across the isthmus of Central America as well to reach the USA West Coast in the late 19th century and, until the 1910s, other European ethnic groups known to live in Costa Rica include Russians, Danes, Belgians, Portuguese, Croats, Hungarians, Armenians and Georgians. Guatemala. 18% of Guatemalans are whites of European descent, in the majority Spanish and German. Nicaragua. Also in Nicaragua, during the mid-19th century and early 20th century, immigration was encouraged by the government, giving land in areas of Esteli, Jinotega, Matagalpa, Managua, El Crucero, Carrizo, Nueva Segovia and Madriz, mainly German, French and Eastern European immigrants who were willing to work the land. There are also Syrians, Armenians, Palestinian, Jewish, and Lebanese communities communities in Nicaragua with a population of about 30,000. Panama. Besides Costa Rica and Nicaragua, around 15% of the Panamanian population is white. Immigration to Panama are represented by ethnic groups in the 19th and 20th centuries: British and Irish, Dutch, French, Germans, Italians, Portuguese, Poles, Russians, and people from the United States. El Salvador. 12% of Salvadorans are mostly descendants of the Spaniard dynasty, with others descending from French, Italians, Portuguese, British, Germans, and some Central Europeans. El Salvador also has a sizable Arab population, mostly Palestinians, Syrian, Lebanese, as well as Jewish. Belize. In 2010 there were 13,964 white people living in Belize, forming 4.6% of the total population. 10,865 or 3.6% of them were Mennonites of German, Dutch descent. Honduras. Less than 5% of the Honduran population is estimated to be white. These are people of mainly Spanish ancestry, although a few are descended from other European groups. Native Americans. The only plurality of Native American or indigenous people located in Central America is in Guatemala. Native Americans have small minorities in the rest of Central American countries. Guatemala. The Amerindian populations in Guatemala include the K'iche' 9.1%, Kaqchikel 8.4%, Mam 7.9%, and Quechua 6.3%. 8.6% of the population is other Mayan. 0.4% is indigenous non-Mayan, making the indigenous community in Guatemala about 40.5% of the population. Belize. Amerindian 10%. Almost all Maya. 3 Maya groups now inhabit the country: the Yucatec, the Mopan, and Quechua. The later groups are chiefly found in the Toledo district. Panama. According to the 2010 census in Panama, approximately 12.3% of the nation's population are indigenous. The Amerindian population figure stood at 417,500 individuals in 2010. Honduras. About 7% of the Honduran population are members of one of the 7 recognized indigenous groups. Nicaragua. 5% of Nicaraguans are Amerindians, the unmixed descendants of the country's indigenous inhabitants. Nicaragua's pre-Columbian population consisted of many indigenous groups. In the western region, the Nicarayo people, after whom the country is named, were present along with other groups related by culture and language to the Mayans. The Caribbean coast of Nicaragua was inhabited by indigenous peoples who were mostly Chibcha-related groups that had migrated from South America, primarily present-day Colombia and Venezuela. These groups include the Miskitos, Ramas, and Sumos. In the 19th century, there was a substantial indigenous minority, but this group was also largely assimilated culturally into the mestizo majority. Costa Rica. There are over 104,000 Native American or indigenous inhabitants, representing 2.4% of the Costa Rican population. Most of them live in secluded reservations, distributed among 8 ethnic groups: Quitrisi, Matambu, Acorotega, Malecus, Bribri, Cabecá, Guaymi, Baruca, and Tairaba. El Salvador. Only 1% of the Salvadoran population is purely indigenous, mostly Mayan, Pipil, Lenca, and Cacahuira. The current low numbers of indigenous people may be partly explained by mass murders during the 1932 Salvadoran peasant uprising. Up to 30,000 peasants were killed in what by modern standards would be considered genocide because of the Salvadoran army's efforts to exterminate a certain racial group. Today many Pipil and other indigenous populations live in small towns of El Salvador like Azalco, Panchamalco, Sacacoyo, and Nacauzalco. Afro-Central Americans, the Creole, Afro-Caribbean, and Garifuna populations form the majority of the Afro-Latin Americans in Central America, of which the majority is concentrated on the Caribbean coasts of the region. It is important to note that all these groups are distinct, speaking English Creoles, Garifuna, Mosquito, and Spanish. The highest percentage is 31% in Belize, where Creoles and Garifuna were once the majority of the nation that has seen heavy emigration and immigration in the last 30 years. The largest population, however, is in Nicaragua of Creole, Afro-Caribbean, and to a lesser degree of Mosquito and Garifuna descent, of which the majority is concentrated on the Caribbean coast in the area often referred to as the Mosquito Coast. In Costa Rica, about 8% of the population is of black African descent, a mulatto who are called Afro-Costa Ricans, English-speaking descendants of 19th-century black Jamaican immigrant workers. In Panama, people of African descent were already present when the construction of an interoceanic channel saw the large arrival of immigrant Afro-Caribbeans. Honduras has a small population of Creole people, but the overwhelming majority of blacks are Garifuna. Afro-Guatemalans are concentrated in the Caribbean department of Izabal and consist of a mix of Garifunas and other Afro-Caribbeans. Although El Salvador is the only Central American country with no official black percentage, El Salvador has had black African slavery in its past history during the colonial era. Over time they mixed with both Amerindians and Europeans, causing their offspring to join into the general mestizo population. But Afro-Salvadoran heritage commonly do exist. Creoles in Belize. Creoles make up roughly 21% of the Belizean population and about 75% of the diaspora. They are descendants of the Bayman slave owners, and slaves brought to Belize for the purpose of the logging industry. These slaves were mostly black from Nicaragua and born Africans who had spent very brief periods in Jamaica. Bay Islanders and more Jamaicans came in the late 19th century, further adding these already varied peoples, creating this ethnic group. For all intents and purposes, Creole is an ethnic and linguistic denomination, but some natives, even those blonde and blue-eyed, may call themselves Creoles. It is defined as more a cultural attribute not limited to physical appearance. Asians. Panama. Chinese Panamanian population today presents 4% or 135,000. Ethnic Chinese in Panama, also variously referred to as Chinese Panamanian, Panamanian Chinese, Panama Chinese, or in Spanish as Chino Panameno, are Panamanian citizens and residents of Chinese origin or descent. Costa Rica. Today, Asians represent almost 1% of the Costa Rican population. The first Chinese people in Costa Rica migrants arrived in Costa Rica in 1855. They were a group of 77 originally from Guangzhou, who had come to Central America to work on the Panama Railway. Of them, 32 found work on the farm of José María Canas, while the remaining 45 were hired by Alejandro von Bülow, an agent sent by the Berlin Colonization Society to prepare suitable sites for German settlement in Costa Rica. During the 1859 to 1863 administration of José María Montealegre Fernández, laws were promulgated which prohibited the migration of blacks and Asians, in an effort to reserve Costa Rica for European settlers. Early Chinese migrants typically arrived by sea through the Pacific coast port of Punta Arenas. A Chinese colony began to form in the area, founded by José Chen Napui, a migrant from Zhongshan, Guangdong who arrived in 1873. Punta was so widely known among the Chinese community as a destination that some in China mistook it for the name of the whole country. In the 1970s, Taiwan began to become a major source of Chinese immigration to Costa Rica. However, they formed a transitory group, with many using Costa Rica as a stopover while they waited for permission to settle in the United States or Canada. Those who settled permanently in Costa Rica included many pensioners enjoying the retirement abroad. Most Chinese immigrants since then have been Cantonese, but in the last decades of the 20th century, a number of immigrants have also come from Taiwan and Japan. Many men came alone to work and married Costa Rican women and speak Cantonese. However, the majority of the descendants of the first Chinese immigrants no longer speak Cantonese and feel themselves to be Costa Ricans. Nicaragua. There are 12,000 Chinese Nicaraguans. Chinese people first arrived in Nicaragua's Caribbean coast in the latter part of the 19th century, and most of them settled in cities such as Bluefields, El Bluff, Laguna de Perlas, and Puerto Cabezas. The Chinese immigrants dominated the commerce of the main coastal towns on the Caribbean coast prior to 1879. Then in the late 19th century, they began migrating to the Pacific lowlands of the country. Garifuna people and Amp others. Garifuna is an Arawakan language spoken in Honduras, Belize, Guatemala and Nicaragua by the Garifuna people. The language is primarily derived from Arawak and Carib, with English, French and Spanish to a lesser degree. One interesting feature of Garifuna is a vocabulary split between terms used only by men and terms used only by women. This does not, however, affect the entire vocabulary, but when it does, the terms used by men generally come from Carib and those used by women come from Arawak. Almost all Garifuna are bilingual or polylingual, speaking the official languages of the countries they inhabit such as Spanish, Creole and English most commonly as a first language. According to one genetics study, their ancestry is on average of 76% Sub-Saharan African, 20% Arawak, Carib and 4% European. Population of Belize. Similarly, the population of Costa Rica is greater than that of Panama, though Panama is larger. Guatemala has the largest population with 13,276,517, followed by Honduras at 7,792,008 and 23,780 square kilometers, with a 77.3 density of hab per square kilometer, although its population is not distributed equally. For example, Belize is larger than El Salvador in area by 1,924 square kilometers, but El Salvador has 30 times the population. Central America is a region formed by 6 Latin American countries and 1 Anglo American nation. As an isthmus, it connects North America with South America, comprising the following countries: Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica and Panama. The inhabitants of Central America represent a variety also identified regularly. People with mestizo ancestry are the largest single group, and along with people of European or part European ancestry, they combine to make up approximately 80% of the population, or even more. Central America has a population of approximately 40 million in 2007 in an area of 500 of ancestries, ethnic groups, and races, making the region one of the most diverse in the world. Some countries have a predominance of European Amerindian or mestizo population, some are dominated by inhabitants of European ancestry, and some countries' populations are primarily mixed. Black, Asian, and Afro-Amerindian minorities are